Welcome to Sounding Board, the podcast about freedom and capitalism. Good evening, Andrew.
Good evening.
You've got a topic of discussion.
I have one that I deliberately haven't mentioned to you.
You like doing this to me.
Yeah, and this is not. I'm landing this on you, but it's not anything. It's not anything we need to answer today.
Okay.
So, never let it be said that we avoid tackling difficult questions.
Yeah.
I mean, that's to say that there's nothing wrong with necessarily going after low-hanging fruit and quick wins, and pointing out obvious flaws in your opponent's arguments. But there are some things that are difficult to ask as voluntarists, libertarians, whatever. There are some difficult questions that people, the sorts of questions that people don't really need to answer because, for example, the government takes care of everything.
Okay, right. So this is partly because we've all grown up in this system, and so there are things that you don't necessarily immediately think about because they're taken care of.
And there's probably no history of it either. If you
Right.
think of how long government's been around, or some kind of leadership. So I wanted to ask a few questions. Now we can split these up into. Well, I can split them up into two types.
Okay.
So there are the basic, what would you do questions, like who will build the roads? What would you do about education, about the police,
Right.
court system, that kind of stuff. They're not too bad. Some of them are quite easy. Some of them are more difficult than others.
Yeah.
And then there's the what should you do? How should you reduce the size or
Right.
end the government, for example? This kind of thing. They can be a
Right.
lot more tricky. So
Okay.
we'll come on to those later. The first difficult question, and I actually had to listen to our last podcast because I remember talking about this with you recently, but we're brothers, we're close, we're 5 minutes away from each other. I couldn't for the life of me remember whether this was just a general conversation over scotch or a podcast, but it turns out we did talk about this a little bit last.
We should just record everything.
Yeah, it was. So it turns out we did talk a little bit about this, and this is about property rights in general. Do you remember on the last podcast we were talking about burrowing down to the centre of the earth and how much
Right.
land is reasonable below your house, because you don't own it currently.
You don't own it. You talk about owning your plot of land and your house, but yeah, we talked, for the benefit of those who haven't listened to the previous episode, we talked about the kind of basement land grab, and how people can go down and then sideways and technically go under where you are, because it's just an odd kind of collection of laws and regulations surrounding downwards into the ground, which also includes digging for oil and stuff as well. So you don't just simply own what's beneath you
Or above you.
Of course, yes.
It's
This column of air.
Yeah,
how
so-
far up are you allowed to stake your claim on?
Yeah. So and we were talking about, and I remember I was talking about one of the things people, libertarians, often say is, well, in homesteading, etc., it's all about mixing your labour with the land, with property.
Working the land.
Yeah. So, but then that's it's not as easy as that either, because you could quite easily use that as a good example for somebody who's going into the unknown, it's completely untouched, and builds a farm, and it's quite clear the land that he's using for farming and planting stuff and building his house and stuff. There are quite clear boundaries there.
Yes.
What about if you come across a lake and you tip a bucket of something in there, a bucket of dye, and then do you own the whole lake? What if it's a thimbleful of something that spreads out? What if you put it in the ocean? It's not quite as simple as that.
Well, I love your idea of going up above your house as well, because how do you tend the air above your house, short of setting a fire and having a column of smoke? And does that count again as doing something?
Yeah, or some kind of bat signal, or some like laser that you're shooting up into the air.
I like that,
of
lasers.
your property.
Yeah.
How,
No one's allowed to break my laser beam.
yeah. How does that work? So it's not quite as easy as that.
No.
So how do you decide how much you own? And it's not even as simple as saying, okay, as a rule, everybody owns the land beneath the earth,
Yeah.
or beneath their house, right to the centre of the core of the earth. You can't even do that, because what if there's oil?
Yeah.
So
How do you possibly apportion the bit of oil that may be underneath you by several 100 feet?
But and the bit of oil under your house, fine.
Yeah.
But that oil isn't just going to be a patch of land.
That's what I'm saying.
Under your house, it's going to be under everybody's house. Is it who gets there first?
Yeah.
How do you ensure that you're not stealing somebody else's oil when you dig for it?
Which is similar to the lake argument, as you're saying there. Yeah. Well, and you were using a kind of, for want of a better term, a contaminant to try and stake the claim or show that you've got you've done something to it.
And you could do that. You could quite easily do that with air as well, with like a factory or something. It's like, well, this is my smoke.
Anything my smoke touches is mine.
Therefore, all this land is mine.
Which is obviously nonsense, but it's good. I see what you're getting at. It's good to actually truly define why that's nonsense or why it's not,
and to try and come up with the rules. That's the thing, and or at least rules that can be interpreted by courts. And that's why it's one of the reasons it's so hard, is because it's all theory.
Yeah.
How would this work? Well, I don't know. English common law, took hundreds of years and through precedent with the courts to get to a reasonable state. And this kind of thing would have to happen with all this as well.
And does that mean, I suppose it's an unfair test because this common law system has grown as the state has grown? I'm
talking about like the origins of common law as opposed to.
So yes, my point being is, was there a perfect moment where it was being done right? But again, I suppose that we have to acknowledge the technological leaps that mankind makes relatively regularly, certainly in the last 200 years. The notion that people would have dug for oil is, in human timeline, relatively recent. So coming up with some of these precedents, the air is a great example of one, and then we'll learn how to fly. So these things do have to be tackled. There'll be something different, and when you start talking about the digital world as well, then that's another interesting idea, because obviously what we do on the internet, what do you own? I mean, this is a hot topic in and of itself, isn't it? Is it Facebook's content? Is it your content that you post on there? Who's responsible for it if it's got something in quotes that breaks the law? Who should take it down? Is it the person who owns the server? Is it the person who owns the connection to the server? Is it the person that wrote the software that deals with the storage, or is it the person that wrote the content that put it in there, etc., etc., etc.? So these are worthy conversations, I suppose, is the point.
Yeah, it is. But it's I just wanted us to address this, and one of my points about this is, I don't think libertarians should be expected to solve everything.
Isn't the point?
People often come up with these questions as like some kind of gotcha. Oh,
yes.
You don't know how to run society. Well,
isn't it the point that we're saying society needs to work these things out for itself without a state that can force a solution?
Correct, because there will undoubtedly be more than one solution for all of these problems.
Competing solutions.
Correct. Yeah.
That's how the market works.
And normally you would have, we should ideally have 7 billion people working together to try and solve these problems, as opposed to just half a dozen libertarians on paper trying to work out how society could work. That's not how these things work. Which is why I don't necessarily like things like, I love the Libertarian Manifesto, but that's just one way that things might work.
Yes.
So you could, as you say, get lots of competing ways of doing things, and which is fine as well, because you can just ally with people that you agree with, and it can be done on a completely voluntary basis.
Yes.
So you can have your Rothbardians who will perhaps group together, and the people who follow David D. Freeman, for example, and other ways. And there's not necessarily just one way, and I don't think it's fair to ask a libertarian to define just how everything would work on his own, when he's had no chance to know. Nobody else is asking or answering these questions.
I agree with that. I think it is incumbent to explain more clearly what we're trying to do right now, which is that obviously the basis of certainly libertarianism is the the non-aggression, non-coercion, don't take my stuff, don't hurt me mantra. So it's a moral framework for everything, and so it's about saying if that doesn't conform to this, then it's not right. But I think that generally libertarians do a really quite a bad job at saying I don't have the answer to this. They themselves take it as a gotcha, I think, a lot of the time. I haven't thought of that yet. It's really complicated. It's not a good answer for it. So to get across that this is about a framework to measure against, I think is a good way of looking at it, and it being a moral framework.
And then anything that society comes up with under that moral framework will be better than what we have now.
And this is also it. There is a relativism to it, which I don't necessarily like, but at the same time, it has to be better. It has to be better because of those basic morals behind it.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on now to the slightly more difficult questions. Okay. Now, cast your mind back to the last time you watched The Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, okay, right.
Do you remember that film?
Oh yeah,
absolute classic.
Yeah, look, I'm not a person who's watched it loads of times. I'm not one of those. Great film. I feel a little bit guilty for not having watched it as many times as lots of other people. It's just the best film ever. But yeah, good film.
So I'll explain why I'm asking you to think about that. So,
yeah.
For the benefit of our viewer and listener, it's a film about a prison and a few characters within Shawshank, within the prison. And one of the characters, well, in fact, a couple of the characters towards the end of the film are released from prison. There's Red, played by Morgan Freeman, and there's another character, Brooks. I think he's an old chap in his,
I think you're right there.
In his 70s. And Red, when he leaves, he really struggles to cope with everyday life because he's been institutionalized.
Yes.
To the point where he's struggling with his relationship a little bit with his boss, and his boss is trying to be helpful and nice, and really means well. And Red keeps asking him if he can go to the bathroom, and his boss, trying to be nice, says, "You don't need to ask me about that anymore. You're not in prison anymore." And he says, "Look, you don't understand. I can't go until you give me permission," because he's that institutionalized that he needs to gain permission to go to the bathroom. And Brooks is even worse, to the point where he commits suicide and he hangs himself because he just
can't cope.
He can't cope. So this is a moral question for you.
God, right.
So if you've got someone that's that institutionalized in prison, I mean, obviously the argument is the prison shouldn't institutionalize people that much, and there should be fewer people in prison for
should we call them guests?
But
I know there is a prison, but anyway.
But let's just say you've got someone who, for whatever reason, is in prison and has been institutionalized.
Yeah.
What's the moral thing to do? What do you do? Because you don't want to release them and for them to hang themselves. And how do you know?
So I suppose,
and I know I'm leading somewhere with this, but just think about that for the time being.
I suppose the first point to make is this is the kind of question that is based on already being in a situation you don't want to be in, and it is a cop out to say, well, I'd never have got them into that situation in the first place, and that is a cop out.
I mean, even with the best intentions of the world, some people will become institutionalized because of the way that their brain works. For example, they might take quicker or whatever, so that it will occur.
If we establish that people need to be incarcerated after a process, regardless of how libertarian that process is, and they get institutionalized, then the re-enabling of them back into society is going to be really difficult. It's arguably one of the most difficult things that currently it happens. And if we're going to talk difficult things, then child protection is a incredibly difficult issue. We don't have the same gun control type issue that the US has, so that's a bit different. But you could also argue that because it's been neutered in this country, that we've lost something that is quite fundamental to our freedom in relation to the state having a monopoly on force. That's why I wanted to just mention that one, even though it's something here that just people wouldn't contemplate. Going to prison and rehabilitation of prisoners, I think, is incredibly difficult, not least of which you've got examples very recently in this country of, I'll use the shorthand, terrorists who've been incarcerated, then let go, or suspected, however you want to do it. I'm not going to get into the laws surrounding it. Getting let go and then immediately committing further terrorist acts or acts of violence against people.
I mean, that's one thing. That's a slightly different argument from them doing harm to themselves, I think.
Agreed, but I think it's that's why I wanted to note it though, because I think that if you're going to get relativistic about it, then I'd rather they hurt themselves than they hurt others. And if I'm going to prioritise, I'm going to prioritise stopping them killing anyone else rather than killing themselves. We've had the conversation before about your life is your own, and so it's a very difficult, it's a very emotive subject again. But you could argue that's their choice, what they do. That's not a nice. But the point is, if the reasons are because they've been incarcerated, then what do you owe them? What moral duty do you owe them to help them back into society?
That's the thing, because the example I'm giving is that they've paid that debt. For whatever it is, society has deemed them that they are now safe. They're not a danger to people. They've paid their debt to society.
I think that's an important prerequisite here, because I've jumped straight to the idea that they might still be dangerous to society.
I mean, that's a different thing. That's an absolute. This is that they're.
You don't mind me jumping to that extreme though in this situation, because that complicates matters massively.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
And obviously, if there's a choice with, do we keep someone in prison because they are likely to blow people up, for example, that's completely different from this person is safe. What do we do with them now? Which is the question that I'm asking. So,
albeit it's always a judgment call.
Yeah, which I alluded to slightly earlier. Who makes the call?
Well, and this is what I have. I have a problem with this across the board, obviously, and there is a problem with incarcerating people anyway, in that you've got to have this court system, whether run by the state or not. Okay, so go back to your hypothetical. Your hypothetical is that someone has, in quotes, paid their debt to society by however means that has been judged by society. They are, we're going to assume they're not a danger to the public, and that's not just yes, they really were. I would want there to be, and I think that society in these situations would provide for services to support that individual, and not least of which because those services do exist in a few ways now. There are charities, there are agencies of government that and there are schemes and community schemes that do this already. There are plenty of do-gooders in the world, and I think that society doesn't want these people. If society is deemed that paying their debt takes this amount of time, then I don't think society wants that person to then kill themselves afterwards. Because otherwise they might as well just put them away for all time. Or society would say, well, I want them dead then. What society is admitting is that they want them dead. So, again, this concept of society being the aggregate of what enough people do. I think that these rehabilitation programs would exist voluntarily. People would get together and make it their mission, either part-time, you and I would go and do an hour here, an hour there, or whatever, to help these people, or there'd be people with that calling in much the same way that people want to be a nurse or look after people, or they get a vocation in a certain thing, regardless of how much it might pay. I think the same thing would apply there as well. And I think there would be a program to get people out of it. And even it might not just be an instant you're out of prison. It might be something that happens more gradually over time by reintroducing freedom slowly, so to speak.
Well, and let's not forget that lots of these people don't want to leave. They've got to the point where they just want to stay there forever.
Yeah.
And they would
should they be given the option to?
That's another question.
What if? I suppose these are questions.
Who pays for it?
Who pays for it? Who pays for it in the first place? If society wants to incarcerate people and agreed as a group or with the checks and balances that's what they should do, then it's the rest of society that's paying for it, unless they're sanctioning seizing the assets, the property of the person in question. This we could go on for a long time working out the nitty-gritty of something like this.
So the reason I was asking you this
Yeah.
was because I think there's a reasonable comparison there with people who are in prison and institutionalized,
Yeah.
and possibly have Stockholm syndrome,
Yes. Okay.
to people in everyday life under a government. And then,
Right. Okay.
So
You're using the same thing as in, if we were to take away the state now, people just wouldn't know what to do.
correct.
Okay.
I absolutely think that lots of people would think, oh no, hang on, I want the government.
Don't feel safe anymore.
Yeah.
Who's going to build the roads?
What's going to happen with the police, with education, with the court system? So
I do sympathise with that, with the Big Bang way of doing this, and we've talked about this on a number of podcasts, and there's plenty of material for us to keep going. We started on just talking about what would you do, how would you just privatise the NHS. We then tried to privatise the whole government. I do have sympathy with the view that it would be a level of chaos for a period of time, and is that desirable? Is that how many people would commit suicide? This is the analogy you're using.
This is where we're going to. How many people would harm themselves because we got rid of an evil in the world?
Yeah.
And what's the moral thing to do?
I think it's worth. It is worth saying. There are. This is a difficult one, but it's not that everything the state does is bad. It's just that it's underpinned by a moral bad. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, yeah, of course, because people still need healthcare, they still need roads.
Exactly.
It's just that.
So in that instant, certain things would be removed that are a net positive on an individual, such as the treatment they're getting. They're going to have an operation tomorrow to give them the triple heart bypass or whatever. Or the support they need, the money, the handout they need to pay the bills the next day. If you're just turning off the taps straight away, then that puts a lot of people in relative jeopardy, doesn't it?
It does, and it's really difficult. So I mean, I would like to think that there will be some way for people to still voluntarily pay to the organisation formerly known as the state, that would still be able to provide goods and services for those who need it without oppressing everybody else. So things like regulation would go, and that would probably be fine. But the NHS would survive for a period of time under voluntary donations until it started splitting off.
Well, and this is my privatisation argument of, if it was just immediately floated on the stock exchange, if all of this stuff was immediately publicly tradable, then transactions would immediately start happening. Things would start splitting off. Ownership would change hands. Things would be closed. Things would be started. But it wouldn't necessarily. I suppose it wouldn't necessarily all immediately stop.
But it's difficult, isn't it? When there's something that
that's how they got you.
Yeah, of course it is, because there's been generation upon generation of people that are institutionalized.
Yeah,
and just have no idea how to. Imagine if you.
But they don't even know how to think about it anymore. Well, they never have.
No, and
you and I have only got to this point because we're basically curious.
and
we've got questioning minds.
Yeah, and then but obviously generations upon generations haven't had to. It's like, imagine if you grew up in prison, and
yes,
and
that's the analogy.
You
were born in prison.
All of your family was born and died in prison.
Yeah.
Another example is there was a young lady who was interviewed. She was from North Korea. I don't think she was in North Korea anymore. She managed to get out. But she was being interviewed by somebody, and they were asking really basic, simple questions for us.
Right.
So they asked her.
Very difficult for her.
Yeah. So they asked her, "What's your favourite colour?" And she couldn't answer. She couldn't comprehend having a favourite of anything, because the state tells you everything. So this question to her was just, it was alien. My favourite.
Interesting.
My favourite colour. I don't know.
I've never even thought about it, because that's not ever come
because
up.
she just
That,
grown
that's
up
how
as a hostage.
little freedom. To not even have the freedom to even think which is my favourite colour. I mean, it's
scary, isn't it?
That's a special kind of authoritarianism, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're not that bad, but we're still, there's an area of life that nobody has ever had to even bother contemplating.
Yes.
For hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So no wonder people don't have all the answers.
And this is why I know before you've talked. Again, one of the questions you asked in a previous edition recently was about if you could do one thing. If you could do one thing, and I think you wanted to go after the education system.
That was one of the education.
One of your
PAYE with the.
Yeah, exactly. And I totally get that. But the reason I bring up the education system again is this concept of critical thinking, and how it's just lacking everywhere. Getting people to actually unpick, to do what is difficult. I don't think you can say that it's easy making that journey to even contemplating what life would be like without a government looking after you. I also want to make the point that I don't feel like it's over, not least of which because there's these types of questions to answer, but I'm constantly questioning whether or not I still have the right idea in what I'm thinking now. And I might be very sure that the moral case for libertarianism is sound, but that doesn't mean that I think that it's necessarily practically what can happen right now, or even that when you get to the absolute extremes again, when you get to concepts of protecting people potentially from themselves or from others, the childcare thing is a really difficult one. We've never really had that conversation on record at all, in terms of child protection and things like that, and the concept of the state taking children away from their parents and stuff like that. But there are real issues there that happen every day, and you can't help but occasionally start thinking about least worst outcomes.
Yeah, and then so there are, I guess there are two things there. So you mentioned on the practicality of doing this.
Yeah.
And people sort of say, oh yeah, it's it's a utopia.
It's a utopia, a utopian idea.
And I guess it kind of is, but the way I look at it is, so when you think of, and you probably laugh at this, but if you think of the government being like the mafia, and being like if you think that, let's just say that anything involving force or coercion or violence over another human being is a crime.
Yeah.
That means that the government kind of, by that definition, is
the worst
criminal organisation.
Yeah.
So I see it being similar to imagining a world without crime, because it's just a big form of crime. So I don't ever expect it to happen. I don't ever expect it to be a world where people don't get burgled.
No,
but that doesn't mean I'm not going to try and to protect myself from burglary.
And this is the general point I make to people when having a conversation with them, is the concept that if the state doesn't do it, no one does, for anything, for absolutely. And obviously the roads is the classic one, but safety nets, and things like this. It's like, why do you think that people won't help other people? Why do you think that you might not want to yourself pay into a private fund that helps you in your time of need? I mean, this stuff this stuff is eminently plausible. In fact, there are actually, if you look, there are actually examples of it that happen all the time, not least of which insurance.
Well, so I as a self-employed person, I have insurance against not being able to work.
Yeah.
And it's not going to pay me as much as I earn now, but if I'm incapacitated, then I'll do okay.
I have, I think it's called income protection insurance.
Yeah.
And I've had that since.
I've had it for donkeys.
Do you know what? I've had it since I owned a house. So that's a fair while now. And I remember having the conversation with my IFA at the time. This is the first time I engaged with a financial advisor because I needed to get a mortgage, and therefore there's obviously loads of bits and pieces. And there's obviously house insurance and stuff like that as well, and life insurance. And it's the concept of the income protection insurance. And it said, like, right, we're gonna target this at paying your mortgage and some bills, scraping by. This isn't luxury. This isn't anything like this. But it's if you can't work. And I remember going through it in some detail, and it wasn't. This wasn't some mis-selling thing. This was getting into it in a really detailed way. How long does it take before it kicks in? How many weeks or months do you go before you can actually claim this? What are the types of things you can claim it for? And I remember having the conversation, being working on computers. Obviously, your hands are fairly important for typing code and stuff like this. And so we got into the details of what happened if you lost the use of your hands or something.
Well, so and I remember with mine was because at the time, I think the last time I did it, I was driving to a contract. So what if I can't drive?
Yes.
That's important to me because I have contracts where I'm driving 1,000 miles a week.
But I remember one example, and it was because it's saying it's not that you can't go and earn somewhere else, but this is about targeting kind of your career right now, and the way you think you're going to go. But if we end up if let's say actually you get some kind of brain injury or something that means that cognitively you can't do the thinking required to do what is a technical subject. At that point, after this many weeks, this would kick in, and you get this, kind of salary for the rest of your life, or until pension age. Doesn't mean you can't go and start a gardening business. Doesn't mean you can't go and do something that you'd earn money on that didn't require the same cognitive ability. But this is the market has provided this. On the end of the example now, but this is something that exists. And yes, of course, you have to earn in order to pay into it, in order to start it. And it's the classic thing of, you can't have a pre-existing condition, so to speak. But you do this when you're young. The other point I want to make is this, and again, there are obviously exceptions. Not everyone is born into a stable family environment, and that's again the child protection issues crop up in these kind of things, let alone death and disease and all sorts. But actually, the concept that families actually should look after themselves more, that the family unit shouldn't necessarily be as small as it kind of is at the moment, and that actually your more distant relatives are part of a wider family, and that financially all of you are looking after all of you all at once. There are plenty of other economic models that if not haven't been tried, aren't usual for our Western current way of living.
If you're not stripped of half your earnings,
there's a lot more money around.
It's a lot easier to do that.
Yeah. But being able to pool your resources in order to help the youngest buy a house, the oldest to have healthcare and social care and stuff like that. It's not, when you take the state away, it's not that those things would disappear. It's that they would be provided for by private companies instead. And because the point being is, if there's a demand for something, someone's going to work out a way of monetizing it. Would you agree?
Yeah. So that was one thing. Another thing I wanted to bring up just before we end this, is that going back to the utopia thing, and people will say, oh yeah, that's your answer to everything is freedom, and that's just all you say for everything. You don't have you don't have necessarily any answers or whatever. It's like, well, my point is that that's just the beginning. if you get rid of the government and you're looking at like a more voluntarist way of doing stuff, that's where the journey starts. That's where it begins. That's not necessarily. That's not me coming up with. I'm not saying that I've got all the solutions to everything. All I'm saying is I don't like the current status. Therefore, there's a whole world of different ways of doing things, and like you say, things would happen. There'd be competition. There'd be different competing ways of providing for people who are homeless, for example, and whatever works the most efficient. You think that people would adopt that way. Providing healthcare for people and care in old age and all these kinds of things.
Competition without regulation drives up standards, drives down price, and encourages innovation. And what that means is new things that somebody else hasn't thought of. And again, I always like to link this back to the concept of the economic plan, the 5-year plan, the planned economy, and the idea that no one person or committee of people could ever possibly work out who should do what. And do we even have to say that out loud? There are people who believe that is possible, but to just let someone's brain think about, hey, I could provide that service. I wonder if I can get someone to buy this, or even and the more modern way in the tech giants I like to bring it back to again is, how can I work out a way of funding this so that actually the consumer gets something for free, but I get someone else to pay for it? So it's not even as simple anymore as, if I make this, can I sell it? Or if I do this for you, can you buy it? I don't think the concept of the way that Google and Facebook and all the others now charge for their products, that wasn't on anyone's. No economist was there thinking, I think this is the way that things are going to go. It was something that somebody tried.
I mean, the closest is probably TV adverts, isn't it? Free TV stations, but have adverts every 15 or 20 minutes.
Yeah,
that's the closest we've had, and they've just
absolutely
taken the ball and run with it. And just one final thing, I think it's almost like if you're coming up with solutions for everything, you're almost giving away to them and yielding and accepting that there is a solution to something, and why not have the government provide it?
Yes, and in fact, I like that angle. If you can keep thinking of the solutions, then someone in charge can keep thinking of the solution. Then we just need you in charge. We just need the person who's got all the ideas.
No. There will be multiple solutions to all of these things, and who knows what they will be.
In the same way that I don't know how to make an iPhone, I also don't know how to solve the problem you're asking me. But someone does. Someone will be out there.
And collectively, there will be many phones, and we can pick and choose which one we want. We can pick and choose which call system that we want to use, and et cetera, which police department we want to pay money into, and the fire department, and insurance companies, and all sorts. So there's not going to be one way of, and there will be some communities who perhaps will be more socialist. You'll still have your Jewish kibbutzim and these small communities of maybe 100 people, which will work fine if that's your thing. Not my thing, so I wouldn't live there. But that's absolutely fine. They're not hurting anybody. It's what's the problem with multiple solutions?
Yeah.
So that was just how I wanted to end it.
No, I like it, and I do like the idea of going for the difficult stuff. It forces you to think in a different way, and I think I probably waffled a bit in the middle there while I was trying to articulate what my brain was trying to get a hold of. But then there are moments where you just, no, it's this,
or you don't have to come up with it. As you said, you don't have to come up with the answers. It's perfectly fine to ask difficult questions and just have a think about them. And you can be a voluntarist, you can be a libertarian without knowing the answer to everything.
I suppose if we're going to devil's advocate this a little bit, it's you can't. The cliche, I suppose, is, well, you can't just say the market will provide everything. That's what's kind of trotted back. If you just go, well, the market will provide that. It's kind of what we're doing now, isn't it? We're kind of just saying, yeah, but the market will do that. And I don't like invoking the market in that way. But it is the simplest way of saying it.
I mean, and is that any worse than the government will do that?
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And I think that the problem, and the reason I haven't even used that term throughout this entire podcast until now, is that I think that people misunderstand what the market is, and I think actually it's almost a useless abstraction. You to actually say a company run by a person who has an idea that will win or lose based on the way they run that business and how good the products and services are that they have it. I mean, I'm defining the market. I'm writing the definition of the market, but the term market is thrown around, certainly by politicians, certainly by people who don't like it, as it having connotations of being bad and of being against the everyday person. I'd much rather describe everyday interactions and stuff like that, and how they can form companies, entities, services, and everything else, than just saying the market. And I think that's big. That's again, we've had these arguments before. It's because terms are taken and twisted, given negative connotations.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously there are going to be things that people just haven't had ideas for.
Yes.
So there might be a brilliant idea that nobody will ever have. So the market hasn't provided this fantastic idea.
Is this a known unknown?
No, it's an unknown. But that's not. So it's not to say that the market will provide everything, but it won't. There's no force, there's no coercion involved, and also the everything that all the examples that these people will throw at you, whether it's healthcare or or providing some kind of food or service, I always throw it back and ask them. So, are you suggesting, in the absence of the government providing this, that there isn't a market? There's not a market for roads. Is that what you're saying? The roads won't get created without the government.
Yeah.
It's just too complicated.
Yeah.
Or that healthcare wouldn't exist. People just don't need it.
Yeah.
So you can always throw it back.
Yeah. You got any more questions for me?
I think that's it. Thank you for watching and listening to Sounding Board. We're on YouTube now if you're listening, and we're also on every podcast app.
Thanks for listening.